There are places that are built to be used, and there are places that are built to change you. At a distance, they can look the same. Stone structures, pillars, chambers, carefully arranged spaces designed with intention. But the difference is not in how they appear, it is in what they do. Across the traditions explored in the secret teachings of all ages, the temple is never just a building. It is not simply a location where rituals take place, or where teachings are delivered. It is part of the system itself. A constructed environment designed to influence perception, to guide movement, to shape experience in ways that are not immediately obvious. This is why temples across different cultures share certain characteristics, even when separated by time and geography. They are aligned with celestial patterns. They are structured with precise geometry. They are built with an attention to proportion that feels deliberate, even when the purpose is not explained, because the temple is not passive, it is active. Every dimension, every angle, every space within it contributes to how it is experienced, and that experience is not random, it is controlled, not in an obvious way, not through force, but through design. The way light enters a chamber, the way sound travels through a corridor, the way movement is directed through a sequence of spaces. Each element plays a role, and when combined they create something more than architecture. They create a condition where the individual entering the space begins to experience a shift, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable but present, because the temple is not designed to present information. It is designed to alter how information is received, and once that shift begins, the space itself becomes part of the teaching, not through explanation but through interaction, which raises a question that changes how these structures are seen entirely. If the temple is not just a place, then what exactly is it? If the initiate carries the structure, the temple becomes the place where that structure is made visible. Not explained, not written, but built. Because within the traditions described in the secret teachings of all ages, the temple is not separate from the teaching. It is the teaching, expressed through space. Every movement within it is intentional. Every transition from one area to another marks a shift, not just physically, but perceptually. The individual does not simply walk through a temple, they move through a sequence, and that sequence is designed to mirror the same progression found within the initiation process itself, from outer to inner, from light to darkness, from noise to silence, from certainty to uncertainty. Each step brings the individual further away from the ordinary structure of the world and deeper into a controlled environment where perception can begin to change. This is why the temple is often described as a representation of something larger, not as a metaphor, but as a functional model, a scaled expression of a broader system, arranged in a way that allows it to be experienced directly. Because just as knowledge is structured in layers, the temple is structured in spaces, outer chambers that are accessible, inner chambers that are restricted, and at the center, a point that represents something beyond both. But this structure is not simply architectural, it is psychological. Each movement inward requires a shift in how the individual engages with what is around them. The external begins to lose its dominance. Attention turns inward. Awareness becomes more focused, more precise. And as this happens, the environment itself begins to feel different. Not because it has changed, but because the way it is being perceived has. This is the purpose of the temple, not to impress, not to display, but to create conditions. Conditions where the individual can move through a structured experience that gradually reshapes how they interpret reality. And this is why the temple cannot be separated from the initiate. One provides the environment, the other provides the awareness. Without both, the process cannot function, because the space alone does nothing. and the individual alone remains within their existing patterns. It is the interaction between the two that creates the shift. But before we move deeper into how these spaces are designed and what specific elements within them are intended to do, take a moment to ground yourself in this progression. If you're starting to see how the initiate, the structure, and the environment all connect, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because each episode is building a system, and the further you move into it, the more those connections begin to align. So the question becomes, if the temple is a constructed environment designed to shape perception, what elements within it are actually doing the work? To understand how the temple functions as part of the teaching, you have to look at how its elements are arranged, because nothing within these spaces is accidental. Across the traditions described in the secret teachings of all ages, the layout of the temple follows a consistent principle: movement from the outer to the inner. This is not simply a physical direction, it is a progression. The outer areas of the temple are accessible. They are often open, visible, and designed to accommodate those who have not yet entered the deeper stages of the system. These spaces may contain symbols, images, or structures that introduce the language of the tradition, but do not reveal its full meaning. They are preparatory. They allow the individual to become familiar with the environment, to begin engaging with its patterns without being overwhelmed by them. As the individual moves further inward, the structure begins to change. Spaces become more enclosed. Light becomes more controlled. Sound becomes more focused. Each shift reduces external distraction and increases internal attention. This is not done abruptly. It is gradual, because the transition itself is part of the process. The individual is not forced into a different state. They are guided toward it. And as this guidance continues, the environment begins to demand a different kind of engagement. Casual observation becomes less effective. The initiate must become more attentive, more aware of subtle changes, more responsive to the way the space itself is influencing their perception. This is where the temple begins to function as more than architecture. It becomes a mechanism, a system that interacts with the senses in a controlled way. Light is used to direct focus. Darkness is used to remove distraction. Sound is shaped to alter awareness. Movement is structured to guide attention from one point to another. Each element contributes to a sequence that mirrors the internal progression of the initiate, from external awareness to internal recognition. And at the center of this structure, there is often a space that represents a culmination, not an endpoint, but a point of convergence, a place where the outer and inner aspects of the system meet. This central space is rarely explained directly. It is experienced, and what is experienced there depends on the state of the individual entering it, because by the time the initiate reaches this point, their perception has already begun to change. They are no longer engaging with the space in the same way they did at the entrance. They are more sensitive, more aware, more capable of recognizing patterns that would have gone unnoticed before. And this is what allows the temple to function as part of the teaching. It does not present meaning in a fixed form. It creates conditions where meaning can emerge through interaction, which means the temple is not simply a container for knowledge. It is an active participant in how that knowledge is revealed. If the temple guides movement from the outer to the inner, then the next layer of its function lies in how it encodes meaning within its structure. Because beyond layout and progression, the temple operates through proportion. Not arbitrary proportion, but relationships. Ratios that repeat, angles that align, dimensions that correspond to patterns found beyond the building itself. Across the systems outlined in the secret teachings of all ages, these proportions are not treated as decorative choices. They are treated as reflections. The idea is simple but precise, that the structure of the temple mirrors the structure of something larger. Whether that is understood as the cosmos, the human body, or a deeper underlying order, the principle remains the same. The temple is built as a model, a way of bringing abstract relationships into a physical form that can be experienced directly. This is why geometry becomes so important, not as mathematics for its own sake, but as a language, a way of expressing relationships that remain consistent regardless of culture or interpretation. A square does not change depending on who observes it. A circle does not shift based on belief. These forms carry a stability that allows them to act as anchors within the system, and when arranged in specific ways, they begin to reveal patterns that extend beyond the immediate structure. The initiate may not be told what these patterns represent, but through repeated exposure, through movement within the space, through the interaction of light, shadow, and proportion, something begins to register. A sense of coherence, a recognition that the space is not random, that its elements relate to each other in a way that feels ordered, even if that order is not fully understood. This recognition is important because it shifts the focus away from isolated details and toward relationships. The initiate begins to see not just what is present, but how it connects, how one element reflects another, how changes in position alter perception, how movement through the space reveals different aspects of the same underlying structure. And this is where the temple extends beyond its physical form, because once this way of seeing is activated, it does not remain confined to the building. The initiate begins to recognize similar patterns elsewhere, in natural forms, in constructed environments, in systems that were not initially associated with the temple itself. This is the purpose of encoding, not to hide meaning in a way that prevents access, but to embed it in a way that requires interaction. The meaning is not extracted, it is encountered, and because it is encountered through experience rather than explanation, it carries a different kind of weight. It is not something that can be easily dismissed or replaced. It becomes part of how perception operates. This is why the temple is described as sacred, not because of what it contains, but because of how it functions. It creates a space where relationships become visible, where structure can be experienced directly, where the individual is not just observing a system, but moving through it, and in doing so beginning to recognize that the same structure may exist beyond the walls that first revealed it. When you step back from the physical structure of the temple, what becomes clear is that its function is not limited to architecture. It is a method, a way of organizing experience so that perception can be guided without direct instruction. Because what the temple demonstrates, more clearly than any written teaching, is that environment shapes awareness, not in an abstract sense, but in a precise and measurable way. Change the light, and attention shifts. Change the scale, and the body responds differently. Change the sequence of movement, and perception begins to follow that sequence. This is not theoretical, it is immediate, and once it is experienced, it becomes difficult to ignore, which is why the temple does not rely on explanation. It does not need to. The individual moving through it begins to recognize the effect directly, and this recognition begins to extend beyond the space itself. Because if a constructed environment can shape perception so effectively, then it raises a larger question. What other environments are doing the same thing, without being recognized? This is where the function of the temple becomes more subtle. It is not only shaping perception within its walls, it is training the individual to recognize how perception is shaped elsewhere, in spaces that are not designed with the same intention. in systems that operate without awareness of their own structure, in everyday environments that influence behavior without appearing to do so, the initiate begins to notice these patterns, not in the same clarity as within the temple, but in fragments, in moments where something feels directed, where attention is pulled in a certain way, where movement follows a path that seems natural, but is actually constructed. And this recognition creates distance, not detachment but awareness, an ability to see that experience is not neutral, that it is shaped, guided, influenced by structures that are often invisible to those moving through them. This is where the temple shifts from being a place to being a reference, a model that reveals how structure operates, and once that model is understood, it can be applied, not in a literal sense but as a way of interpreting the world, because the same principles begin to appear in different forms, in how information is presented, in how spaces are arranged, in how attention is directed across different contexts. And this is where the initiate's role begins to expand again, because they are no longer only moving through structured environments, they are recognizing structure everywhere, seeing how perception is shaped, even in systems that were not designed with the same level of awareness. And this changes how those systems are engaged with, because once the structure becomes visible, it can no longer operate in the same way. It loses its invisibility, and in losing that invisibility, it loses part of its influence. This is the deeper function of the temple, not just to shape perception, but to reveal that perception is always being shaped. And once that is recognized, the way the world is experienced begins to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, as more patterns become visible, as more structures begin to reveal themselves, as the individual moves from simply existing within environments to understanding how those environments operate. If the temple reveals that space can shape perception, then its influence does not end at its walls. It continues wherever structure exists, because once the individual has moved through an environment that is deliberately designed to guide awareness, something shifts in how all environments are experienced. They are no longer neutral. They are no longer simply places to move through without question. They become systems, arrangements of form, light, movement and sequence that influence how attention is directed and how meaning begins to take shape. And this recognition is not theoretical, it becomes immediate, subtle but persistent. The individual begins to notice how certain spaces create focus, while others create distraction, how movement is encouraged in one direction rather than another, how the arrangement of elements changes the way something is perceived, even when the elements themselves remain the same. This is the continuation of what the temple begins, not a lesson that ends, but a shift that carries forward, because once the relationship between structure and perception is recognized, it cannot be easily ignored. It becomes part of how the world is interpreted, and this is where the idea of sacred space begins to evolve. It is no longer confined to specific locations or traditions. It becomes a principle, a way of understanding that certain conditions create certain responses, that the environment is not separate from experience, but actively involved in shaping it. And with that understanding comes a different kind of awareness, not just of the spaces that are intentionally designed, but of those that are not, spaces that influence without intention, systems that shape behavior without recognizing that they are doing so. And this awareness creates a form of choice, not the ability to control every environment, but the ability to recognize how those environments are operating, to move through them with attention rather than assumption, to see where perception is being guided and where it can be redirected. This is what the temple prepares the individual for, not to remain within its structure, but to carry its principles beyond it, to recognize that the same patterns can appear anywhere, in architecture, in systems, in the arrangement of information, in the ways attention is directed across different aspects of life. And as this series continues, those patterns will begin to expand, moving from physical space into systems of thought, into symbolic frameworks, into structures that operate beyond what can be directly seen. Because the temple is only one expression of a larger idea, an idea that continues to appear in different forms, each one revealing another aspect of how perception is shaped and how it can be understood. And once that idea begins to take hold, the world itself starts to feel less like a collection of separate experiences and more like a series of interconnected structures, each one influencing the next, each one revealing something about the system as a whole, which is where the next stage begins. Because if space can be structured, then so can language. And what happens when the structure of language itself begins to shape how reality is understood?